Billy Abbott and Sally Spectra, A Night to Remember. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden rays through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Billy Abbott's penthouse apartment, painting warm streaks across the polished hardwood floors and illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily in the still air. Billy stood at the kitchen island, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his brow furrowed in a mixture of concentration and anticipation that made him look years younger than the life he had lived would suggest. He had been planning this evening for the better part of a week, ever since the moment Sally Spectra had sat across from him at the small cafe on Walnut Street and told him, with trembling hands wrapped around a cup of tea she never drank, that she was pregnant. The news had landed like a thunderclap in the middle of what had otherwise been an ordinary Tuesday. Billy remembered the way her voice had wavered, the way her green eyes had searched his face for some sign of how he would react, the way she had bitten her lower lip as though bracing herself for the worst. And he remembered, too, the strange and immediate swelling in his chest, not panic, not dread, but something far more complicated. Something that felt like hope braided tightly with fear, joy tangled up with the kind of grief that never fully leaves a person's bones. Because Billy Abbott knew loss, he knew it intimately the way one knows the contours of a scar that has long since healed on the surface but still aches when the weather changes. He had lost Delia, his beautiful, bright-eyed little girl, taken from him in a way so sudden and so cruel that there were still nights when he woke gasping, reaching for a small hand that was no longer there. The memory of Delia lived in every corner of his heart, and when Sally had spoken those two words, "I'm pregnant," it was Delia's face that flashed before his eyes first, her laughter that echoed in his ears, her absence that made the prospect of new life feel both miraculous and terrifying. But Billy had made a decision in that cafe, sitting across from a woman who was clearly just as scared as he was. He had reached across the table, taken her hands in his, and told her that whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. He meant it then and he meant it now, standing in his kitchen surrounded by the evidence of a man who was trying, with everything he had, to show the woman he loved that she was cherished. On the counter before him sat a single red rose, its petals dark and velvety, still beaded with droplets of water from the florist's careful wrapping. He had considered buying an extravagant bouquet, armfuls of flowers in every color, the kind of arrangement that would fill an entire room with fragrance and spectacle. But something had stopped him. Sally Spectra was a woman who appreciated grand gestures, certainly, but she was also a woman who could see through them. She had a sharp eye and a sharper wit, and Billy knew that what would move her most was not the quantity of the offering but the intention behind it. One rose, perfect and deliberate, chosen with care and presented with meaning. That was the gesture he wanted to make. He glanced at the clock on the wall. She would be here in 2 hours. That gave him enough time to finish the preparations, to set the table with the good china he rarely used, to light the candles he had purchased from the small boutique on Crimson Avenue, to cue up the playlist he had spent an embarrassing amount of time assembling. The music was important. He had chosen songs that traced the arc of their relationship, from the early days of sparring and flirtation to the deeper, more tender moments that had drawn them irrevocably closer. There was the jazz standard that had been playing the first time they danced together at the athletic club, the rock ballad she had been humming the morning he woke to find her making coffee in his shirt, the quiet acoustic number that had become their unspoken anthem during the weeks when they were still figuring out what they were to each other. Billy moved through the apartment with purposeful energy, straightening a cushion here, adjusting a picture frame there. He paused at the bookshelf near the window and pulled out a small leather-bound photo album he had assembled over the past few days. Inside were photographs and mementos of their time together, a snapshot from the charity gala where Sally had worn that emerald dress that made every head in the room turn, a ticket stub from the terrible movie they had watched on their third date and spent the entire time laughing through, a pressed flower from the bouquet he had sent her after their first real argument, when he had been too stubborn to apologize in person but not too stubborn to admit he was wrong. Each item was accompanied by a handwritten note in Billy's somewhat uneven script, explaining why the memory mattered to him, what it had taught him, how it had changed him. He knew the album was sentimental, perhaps even a little corny, and there was a part of him, the old Billy, the reckless Billy, the Billy who had once used charm and bravado as armor against vulnerability, that wanted to dismiss the whole thing as too soft. But he silenced that voice. He had spent too many years running from his own tenderness, and it had cost him dearly. It had cost him relationships and trust, and at his lowest points, his own sense of who he was. He was not going to let it cost him this. The table was set, two places facing each other with the candles positioned to cast a warm, flattering glow without being so bright as to feel interrogative. He had ordered dinner from Giancarlo's, the Italian restaurant Sally loved, and the food would arrive in an hour: fresh pasta, the sea bass she always ordered, tiramisu for dessert. He had debated cooking himself, but Billy was honest enough to know that his culinary skills, while adequate for breakfast and the occasional weekend lunch, were not equal to the magnitude of what this evening was supposed to represent. Tonight was not the night for overcooked risotto and a smoke alarm. As he worked, his mind kept circling back to the question that had been living in the back of his thoughts for days. The question that sat in his jacket pocket in the form of a small velvet box he had picked up from the jeweler 3 days ago. A ring. Not an engagement ring exactly, or maybe exactly that, depending on how the evening went and what his instincts told him when the moment arrived. He had gone back and forth on the idea of a proposal more times than he could count. Part of him wanted to drop to one knee and offer Sally everything: his name, his future, the full and unconditional promise of a life built together. It would be dramatic and romantic, and exactly the kind of bold move that Billy Abbott was known for. But another part of him, the wiser part, the part that had learned through years of mistakes that love sometimes requires patience more than it requires spectacle, counseled restraint. Sally was overwhelmed. The pregnancy had upended her entire sense of what her life was going to look like, and she was still processing the enormity of it. To add a marriage proposal on top of everything else might feel less like a romantic gesture and more like pressure, another enormous decision demanding her attention when she was already stretched thin. Billy did not want to be another source of stress in Sally's life. He wanted to be her refuge from it. So the ring stayed in his pocket, a possibility rather than a plan, and Billy focused instead on the things he could control. The atmosphere, the attention to detail, the words he would say when Sally walked through the door and saw what he had done for her. He rehearsed those words now, murmuring them under his breath as he polished a wine glass, or rather a sparkling cider glass, since Sally obviously would not be drinking tonight. "I want you to know," he said softly to the empty room, "that you are not alone in this. That I am here fully and completely, not because I feel obligated, but because there is nowhere else I would rather be. You are my partner, Sally. You are my equal. And tonight I want to show you that you are my queen." He winced slightly at the last word, wondering if it sounded overwrought, but then he let it stand. It was how he felt, and this was an evening for honesty, not editing. The doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock, and Billy's heart gave an unexpected lurch. He wiped his palms on his trousers, took a steadying breath, and opened the door. Sally stood on the threshold in a deep blue dress that complemented the red of her hair, which fell in loose waves around her shoulders. She looked beautiful and slightly uncertain, her eyes moving past him to take in the candlelit apartment, the carefully set table, the soft music drifting from the speakers. Her lips parted in surprise, and for a moment she said nothing, just stood there absorbing the scene. "Billy," she finally breathed, "what is all this?" He stepped aside to let her in, and as she passed him, he picked up the single red rose from the counter and presented it to her with a small, almost shy smile. "This," he said, "is me asking you to let me give you a wonderful night. No stress, no big decisions, no worrying about tomorrow. Just us tonight, remembering why we chose each other." Sally took the rose and held it to her nose, inhaling its fragrance, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with the beginning of tears she was clearly determined not to shed. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. "I know I didn't have to," Billy replied. "That's exactly the point." He led her to the sofa first, where the leather photo album waited on the coffee table. Sally picked it up with curiosity, and as she opened the first page and saw the photograph from the charity gala, a laugh escaped her, warm and genuine, and full of the kind of uncomplicated joy that Billy wished he could bottle and keep. "Oh my God," she said, tracing the edge of the photo with her fingertip. "I remember this night. You spilled champagne on the mayor's wife and tried to pretend it was a waiter." "In my defense," Billy said, settling beside her, "the waiter was standing right there and the mayor's wife was very forgiving." "She was not forgiving at all. She sent you the dry cleaning bill, which I paid without complaint because I am a gentleman." Sally snorted, a sound so inelegant and so perfectly her that it made Billy's chest ache with affection. They turned the pages together, and with each new photograph, each ticket stub and pressed flower and handwritten note, the story of their relationship unfolded like a map of the journey that had brought them to this exact moment. There were memories that made them laugh and memories that made them go quiet, moments of triumph and moments of struggle, the whole beautiful, messy, imperfect tapestry of two people learning to love each other. When they reached the last page, which held a recent photo of the two of them, candid, unposed, taken by a friend at a weekend brunch, both of them laughing at something long since forgotten, Sally closed the album gently and held it against her chest. "You did this for me," she said, "and it was not a question." "I did this for us," Billy corrected, "because I wanted you to see what I see when I think about where we've been. We're not perfect, Sally. We've stumbled, we've argued, we've driven each other crazy. But every single page in that album is proof that we're worth it, that what we have is real and strong enough to build on." Sally set the album down carefully and turned to face him, tucking one leg beneath her on the sofa. The candlelight caught the angles of her face, the high cheekbones, the determined set of her jaw, the vulnerability that she allowed so few people to see. "I'm scared, Billy," she said quietly. "I need you to know that. I'm really genuinely scared." "I know," he said, "I am too." "You don't seem scared." It's because I've had a week to practice hiding it while I planned this dinner. He paused, then let the humor drain from his voice, replacing it with something raw and unguarded. I'm terrified, Sal. Every time I think about this baby, I think about Delia. I think about what it felt like to hold her for the first time and what it felt like to lose her, and I can't separate those two things yet. The joy and the fear are all tangled up together, and I don't know how to pull them apart. Sally reached for his hand. I think about Ava, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Every day, I think about how excited I was, how I started imagining this whole future, and then, she trailed off, swallowing hard. I'm afraid to let myself hope, Billy. I'm afraid that if I get excited, if I let myself believe that this time will be different, the universe will punish me for it. They sat in the weight of that shared grief for a long moment, two people who had each buried a child in their own way, who understood the particular agony of a future that was stolen before it could begin. Billy tightened his grip on Sally's hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. I can't promise you that nothing will go wrong, he said. I wish I could, but I've learned the hard way that those kinds of promises are just words. What I can promise is that whatever happens, the good, the bad, the terrifying, all of it, you will not go through it alone. I am here, Sally. I am on board, not halfway, not with one foot out the door, completely, fully, all the way. Dinner arrived shortly after, and they moved to the table, where the conversation shifted to lighter territory, work gossip from Newman Enterprises and Abbott Chancellor, a spirited debate about whether the Italian restaurant had changed its pasta recipe, a shared fantasy about traveling to the coast once the baby was born. They ate slowly, savoring the food and each other's company, and Billy watched the tension gradually leave Sally's shoulders, watched her posture soften and her smile come more easily, and he knew that this evening at least was doing what he had hoped it would do. Over dessert, Billy reached across the table and covered Sally's hand with his own. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer honestly, not with what you think I want to hear. Sally set down her fork and met his eyes. Okay. Are you ready to move forward with this pregnancy? Not in a theoretical way, not in an I'll think about it way, but really, truly ready to say yes to this, with all the appointments and the vitamins and the planning and the fear and the hope, all of it. Sally was quiet for a long time, and Billy let the silence stretch, understanding that she needed it. He could see her thinking, could see the war between caution and desire playing out behind her eyes, and he did not rush her. He simply waited, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. Yes, she finally said, and the word came out steady and sure, as though she had been gathering her courage for days and had finally found enough to speak. I'm ready. I'm scared out of my mind, but I'm ready. I want this baby, Billy. I want this future. Billy felt something unlock in his chest, a tightness he had not even realized he was carrying dissolving all at once, and he had to blink hard against the sudden sting in his eyes. Then we're doing this, he said, together. Together, Sally echoed, and her smile was like sunrise. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of energy, a sense of forward motion that felt both exhilarating and daunting. Sally threw herself into the practical aspects of the pregnancy with the same fierce determination she brought to everything in her life. She scheduled her first doctor's appointment, began researching obstetricians, downloaded 3 different pregnancy apps on her phone, and spent an evening comparing their features with the kind of analytical intensity she usually reserved for fabric swatches and design deadlines. Billy watched her with a mixture of admiration and amusement, recognizing in her frantic organization the same impulse he felt himself. The need to do something, to take action, to impose some sense of control on a situation that was, by its very nature, fundamentally beyond their control. He accompanied her to the first appointment, holding her hand in the waiting room while she filled out forms and pretended not to notice the other expectant mothers scattered around the room in various stages of pregnancy. Billy was acutely aware of the ring still sitting in his jacket pocket at home, transferred from one coat to another like a talisman he was not yet ready to deploy. He thought about it at odd moments, while brushing his teeth, while sitting in meetings, while watching Sally frown at her phone as she read conflicting advice about prenatal nutrition. The proposal was a living thing in his mind, growing and evolving alongside the baby, and he knew that the right moment would announce itself when it arrived. He just had to be patient enough to recognize it. The doctor was a brisk, reassuring woman named Dr. Akaffer who had a calm manner and a no-nonsense approach that Sally immediately responded to. She confirmed the pregnancy, ordered blood work, and discussed the timeline for the first ultrasound, which would take place in a few weeks. Billy asked questions he had written down on his phone about risk factors, about warning signs, about what they could do to give this baby the best possible chance. He did not mention Delia by name, but Dr. Akaffer seemed to sense the weight of unspoken history in the room and addressed their concerns with a gentleness that went beyond professional courtesy. Every pregnancy is different, she told them. What happened before does not dictate what will happen now. Your job is to take care of yourselves, eat well, rest when you can, and let me worry about the medical side of things. That's what I'm here for. Sally nodded, gripping Billy's hand so tightly that his fingers went numb, and Billy nodded too, filing away the doctor's words to replay on the nights when anxiety came creeping in like fog through an open window. The weeks between the first appointment and the ultrasound were a particular kind of limbo. Sally was visibly pregnant to no one but herself, hyper-aware of every sensation in her body, every twinge and flutter interpreted through the lens of both hope and dread. Billy did his best to be a steady presence without being suffocating, bringing her ginger tea when nausea struck, rubbing her feet without being asked, texting her funny memes during work hours just to make her smile. He was learning, in real time, the difference between the kind of love that announces itself loudly and the kind that shows up quietly, day after day, in 100 small and unremarkable ways. They talked about Delia and Ava more openly than either of them had expected. It happened naturally in the late evenings when they lay side by side in bed with the lights low, the darkness making it easier to say the things that daylight kept at bay. Billy told Sally about the way Delia used to mispronounce the word spaghetti, turning it into something that sounded like paschetti, and how even now, years later, he could not hear the word without smiling and hurting at the same time. Sally told Billy about the tiny onesie she had bought for Ava, covered in a print of little yellow ducks, and how she still had it folded in the bottom drawer of her dresser because she could not bring herself to throw it away but also could not bear to look at it. These conversations were not easy. They were, in fact, some of the hardest conversations either of them had ever had, requiring a level of vulnerability that went against every defensive instinct they possessed. But they had them anyway because they both understood in the marrow of their bones that the only way to build a future was to stop running from the past. The grief would always be there. It had earned its place. The trick was learning to carry it alongside the hope, to hold both truths at once without being crushed by either. The morning of the ultrasound arrived with a gray, overcast sky that felt symbolically heavy, and Sally joked grimly in the car that the weather was matching her anxiety level. Billy laughed and turned up the radio, and they sang badly along to a pop song neither of them particularly liked, and by the time they pulled into the parking lot of the medical center, some of the tension had eased. In the examination room, Sally lay on the table with her shirt pulled up and her hand gripping Billy's so hard that he was fairly certain she was leaving permanent indentations. Dr. Acaffer applied the gel cold, Sally flinched, Billy squeezed back, and began moving the ultrasound wand across Sally's abdomen while studying the monitor with practiced eyes. The room was quiet except for the hum of the machine and the rapid, rhythmic sound that filled the air like a tiny galloping horse. The heartbeat. Billy felt his own heart stutter in response, felt the world narrow to this small room and this extraordinary sound, and when he looked at Sally, tears were streaming silently down her cheeks. "There we go," Dr. Acaffer said, pointing to the screen. "There's your baby, looking good, strong heartbeat, right on track for." She paused, tilting her head, adjusting the wand slightly. Her expression shifted into something more focused, more intent, and Billy felt a spike of alarm pierce through the wonder. "What?" Sally asked, her voice sharp with sudden fear. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Dr. Acaffer held up a calming hand, continuing to move the wand, her eyes never leaving the screen. Then slowly a smile spread across her face, a warm, genuine, slightly conspiratorial smile that transformed her usually composed features. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "In fact, everything is very right. I'm just going to need you both to take a breath because it looks like we have a bonus." "A bonus," Billy repeated, not comprehending. Dr. Acaffer turned the screen so they could both see it clearly and pointed to two distinct shapes, two small, flickering pulses of light nestled side by side in the gray landscape of the ultrasound image. "That," she said, indicating one, "is baby A, and that," she said, moving her finger, "is baby B. Congratulations, you're having twins." The silence that followed was absolute. Billy stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing, and then he looked at Sally, whose tears had stopped in shock, her mouth open, her eyes wide, her expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and a wild, incredulous joy. "Twins," Sally whispered. "Twins," Dr. Acaffer confirmed. "We're having twins," Billy said, and then he laughed, a sudden, involuntary burst of laughter that came from somewhere deep and uncontrolled. The kind of laugh that happens when the world cracks open and pours out more than you ever thought it could hold. Sally started laughing too, and then crying again, and then laughing and crying at the same time, and Billy gathered her hand against his chest and held it there while the sound of two heartbeats filled the room like the most beautiful, terrifying symphony either of them had ever heard. In the car afterward, they sat in the parking lot for a long time without starting the engine. The enormity of the news was still settling, still finding its shape in their minds, and neither of them seemed ready to drive back into the ordinary world where this extraordinary thing would have to coexist with traffic and errands and the mundane machinery of daily life. "Two bobbies," Sally said, staring through the windshield at the gray sky, which had begun to show cracks of blue. "Billy, that's two of everything. Two cribs, two car seats, two college funds, two sets of midnight feedings, too." Two chances, Billy said quietly, two hearts, two people we get to love. Sally turned to look at him and her expression softened. And twice the risk, she said, because she could not help it, because the fear was always there, a shadow companion to every bright thought. A twin pregnancy is higher risk, Billy. You heard what Dr. Acuffer said about monitoring, about the increased possibility of complications, about. I heard her, Billy said. I heard all of it, and I also heard two heartbeats. I heard our children, Sally, both of them alive and strong and real. He took her hand again, the gesture that had become their anchor, their shorthand for everything they could not always say in words. We're going to be scared, that's a given. We're going to lie awake at night worrying about every possible thing that could go wrong because that's who we are and that's what we've been through. But we are also going to show up for these bobbies every single day, and we are going to do it together, and we are going to be the kind of parents that Delia and Ava would be proud of. Sally's face crumpled at the mention of those names, the children who had come before, the ones who had not gotten the chance to stay, and she leaned across the console and pressed her forehead against Billy's shoulder. He held her there, one hand cradling the back of her head, and they breathed together in the quiet car while the sky continued to clear above them. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of appointments and adjustments and the slow, tentative process of allowing themselves to be excited. Sally's morning sickness intensified, twice the bobbies, twice the nausea, because the universe has a sense of humor. She groaned one morning from the bathroom floor, and Billy became an expert in ginger remedies, pressure point wristbands, and the art of holding back his partner's hair without being asked. He read books about twin pregnancies, highlighted the important passages, and left them strategically around the apartment where Sally would find them, pretending each time that he had no idea how they got there. They told their families and friends in stages, watching the news land differently on each person, delight, surprise, concern, unsolicited advice, and in the case of Billy's mother Jill, a tearful embrace that lasted so long Billy thought she might never let go. The Genoa City rumor mill began to churn, as it always did, and Sally and Billy found themselves the subject of whispered conversations and speculative glances wherever they went. They weathered it with a mix of humor and defiance, closing ranks against the noise of the outside world and focusing on the private universe they were building together. There were hard days. There were days when the anxiety spiked and the memories of loss pressed close and the future felt more threatening than promising. There were nights when Sally woke from dreams she would not describe and Billy held her in the dark, offering no words because none were adequate, offering only his presence, his warmth, the steady beat of his heart against her back. There were moments when Billy retreated into himself, overwhelmed by the weight of what was coming, and Sally let him go, understanding that he needed space to wrestle with his own ghosts before he could come back to her whole and ready. But there were good days, too, days that outnumbered the hard ones and grew more frequent as the weeks passed. The day they heard the heartbeats again at the follow-up appointment and both of them cried without embarrassment. The day they bought the first pair of baby shoes, impossibly tiny, hilariously impractical, chosen purely because Sally fell in love with the design and Billy could not say no to the look on her face. The day Billy came home to find Sally standing in the spare room with a tape measure and a faraway look in her eyes, already imagining two cribs, two mobiles, two small people who would fill this space with noise and chaos and love. And through it all, the ring waited. Billy carried it with him now, not just in his jacket but in his awareness, a constant gentle pressure reminding him that there was still one more gesture to make, one more promise to offer. He was not waiting for the perfect moment anymore. He had learned through Delia and through all the imperfect, beautiful years of his life that perfect moments were a myth. What existed instead were real moments, messy, complicated human moments, and the courage to show up for them anyway. He would know when it was time, and when that time came, he would not hesitate. He would get down on one knee and offer Sally Spectra everything he had, everything he was, and everything he hoped to become, and he would trust that their story, with all its grief and all its joy, with its two tiny heartbeats growing stronger every day, was only just beginning. For now, though, it was enough to be here. It was enough to be together. It was enough to sit on the sofa on a quiet evening with Sally's head on his shoulder and her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly, feeling the weight of the future settle around them like a blanket, heavy and warm and full of possibility. Billy pressed a kiss to the top of her head and closed his eyes, listening to the silence, which was not really silence at all but the sound of a life being built, one heartbeat at a time. Two heartbeats, two chances, two children who would carry forward the love of everyone who had come before them, including a little girl who loved spaghetti and a baby in a yellow duck onesie who never got to come home. Billy Abbott and Sally Spectra had been through the fire, separately and together, and they had emerged not unscathed but unbroken. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, full of doctor's appointments and sleepless nights and the kind of fear that only parents know. But they would walk it side by side, hand in hand, and they would face whatever came with the knowledge that they had already survived the worst and chosen, despite everything, to hope again. That was not weakness, that was the bravest thing either of them had ever done. And it was only the beginning.